Good evening, folks. Chris here once again with Indaba Africa on the 14th of April 2020 on what is not the best of news for South Africa and South Africans. As today, the ANC government has finally decided to cut South African Airways loose. The airline in desperate straits, asking once again for government guarantees, bailouts so it can borrow money, has reached the end of the road. As today, the government has told those handling the bankruptcy of South African Airways that it will no longer support handing money over. South Africa's pragmatic finance minister, Tito Mboweni, has long advocated cutting the airline loose, and now it looks as like the airline will have little option but to liquidate. Founded on the 1st of February 1934, over 86 years ago, the airline survived quite a long time. Think back to that era in 1934. Adolf Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany. Nazi Germany was just starting the horrors that would become the late 1930s and the Second World War. The National Party was still 14 years away from its fantastic victory for the National Party in 1948 when it took over the reins of power in South Africa and began implementing a system of apartheid. Still 14 years off when South African Airways came into existence. South African Airways today has 45 aircraft, flies to 42 destinations, domestic and international. The airline itself has 5,752 employees, or it did before the shutdown, the recent Wuhan coronavirus COVID-19 forced inspired shutdown and lockdowns around the world. 5,752 employees. But the group includes Mango, a low-cost carrier with 713 employees, and others who work throughout the business lines, bringing the total working for the South African Airways to 10,071 employees on the most recent figures from 2017. South African is part of the Star Alliance. This latest bailout that the government had promised in their previous budget announcement from the finance minister not all that long ago had promised to guarantee 4 billion additional rand of loans for South African Airways, but the airline was only able to secure 2 billion of that as creditors were unwilling to extend it further credit. And that money is gone. South African Airways is out of cash and out of options, with the government no longer willing to back it. With its passenger service grounded as a result of the lockdown, the only air operations currently taking place at South African Airways are its charter flights, repatriating South African citizens from around the world, and cargo services, which remain in operation and are uninterrupted by the COVID-19 situation. So that raises a number of questions when it comes to South African Airlines, not the least of which is we need to ask, what now? What happens from this point? Well, short of an 11th hour savior or a sugar daddy of some sort, someone willing to swoop in, South African Airways is headed for certain liquidation. An airline will no longer exist. Its assets will be sold off to pay creditors, and South Africans will be left in a bind when it comes to air travel. Well, who benefits from this? And what happens now? People still need to fly. South African Airways carried an average of about 9.5 to 10 million passengers the last several years. Those folks still need to get on flights and get from one place to another, both domestically and internationally. Well, who out there could benefit? Well, there are only a few options. Domestically, Comair or Commercial Airways could possibly benefit from this bankruptcy. The airline is profitable. Founded in 1943, it is the British Airways franchisee that operates British Airways painted aircraft in South Africa. And Comair flies 20 aircraft to 11 different destinations. And those destinations are not just domestic, they also include international, such as Namibia, Zambia, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe. So it is perhaps best positioned, although it would be short on aircraft. It currently carries about a 76% passenger load, which is pretty good. But the airline would need more aircraft. If the aircraft that belong to South African Airways are auctioned off, not talking about ones that may be leased, if they're auctioned off, they may be available once we come out of the COVID-19 lockdown. So it is possible that potentially Comair could pick up some of the routes and alleviate some of the seat shortages which are bound to be in existence once South African Airways is liquidated. But Comair also owns Kulula. Kulula is a low-cost airline on the model of Southwest Airlines here in the United States. And what is Kulula? Well, Kulula is a Nguni word which means it's easy. That's a clever name for an airline. So they have 10 aircraft and fly to 6 destinations inside of South Africa. Now, interestingly, Kulula is similar to Southwest in that its entire fleet consists of Boeing 737s. 9 of the 10 current aircraft are 737-800s. So the latest models out there, efficient, effective, and easy to turn around quickly. So they potentially could also pick up some of the weight there, pick up pilots from South African Airways and flight attendants, things like that, maybe ground service crews and some of their vacancies that are going to be sitting there now. Beyond that, in South Africa, the only other carrier that might be able to do something is Fly SAF Air, but SAF Air only flies to 6 destinations. Well, that's what Kulula flies to, but they're relatively new in the passenger service business, having been a cargo airline for such a long time. Now back to Kulula. The interesting thing about Kulula is, like I said, with South African Airways, with Southwest Airlines, they fly 737s. So they have a simplified maintenance stream. Parts fit on aircraft, and they don't have to maintain multiple models. But the shortfall here is that some of the less traveled destinations domestically within South Africa don't require 737, which would lead to a lot of empty seats on aircraft. So either if Comair or Kulula is to pick up some of these routes, they may have to lease new aircraft, smaller aircraft, perhaps Embraer or something in the order of what is coming out of what used to be Bombardier, but now belongs to Airbus with their mid-range, mid-size aircraft. So what happens on the international flights? Well, that depends on who survives the Wuhan coronavirus or COVID-19 crisis. With air travel severely constrained around the planet, a lot of airlines are in desperate straits. Just here today in the United States, the U.S. government announced a plan to compensate major airlines for losses incurred as a result of the government shutting down air travel for the most part here in the United States and internationally. Massive package of $25 billion to tide over airlines in the short term. That money is not available in South Africa, so airlines will have to survive. And many countries, that sort of money is not available. So what happens? Well, some potential actors who could move in and pick up at least some of the slack on South African Airways international routes would be folks like Ethiopian, a prime candidate, perhaps Kenya Airways, although they would be more constrained with limited capital. But nonetheless, if they survive, it could be an opportunity for them to pick up some routes. Qatar and Emirates are 2 prime candidates potentially if they're willing to lay out the capital cost and pick up market share. That's a very real possibility, both of those being state-supported airlines and profitable. At least Emirates is. I believe Qatar is profitable too. Beyond that, who else is a likely candidate? Well, there is one candidate that does stand out, that does have natural ties to South Africa owing to long history of close ties with Germany and a large ethnic German component of South Africa's population, and that would be Lufthansa. The Lufthansa Group has previously swept in and saved other airlines, including Swiss Airlines and Brussels Airlines. And so it's through its subsidiary potentially an actor that could work very well in Africa and pick up those international routes. Potentially could be Brussels Airlines, but they would need some other aircraft. Currently, they have 58 aircraft. They fly to 100 destinations. Many of those destinations are in Africa. Brussels Airlines now has approaching 2 decades of experience. And if you take its long history of having been SM Brussels and Sabina long before that, it even has many more decades of experience in Africa. But in its recent incarnation as Brussels Airlines, it has been operating for going on about 15 years or so. And it has been flying to Africa, has a lot of experience in West Africa, and could bring that to bear with routes in South Africa. So those are some of the potential lifelines out there for either rescuing South African Airways or picking up the shortfall. People will still need to travel. What happens when it's liquidated? International travel, domestic air travel still needs to happen. Now, some of you who are alert or aware of things may notice that I'm wearing a very old Springbok jersey today. And this is a throwback jersey from a time when South African Airways was still profitable. And you can see this jersey made out of cotton is not something anybody wears anymore. It's been at least a decade since this jersey has been worn. And I just wore that tonight kind of as a throwback to remember that the airline was once profitable. So there you have it, South African Airways at the end of the road. And what happens now? Well, how do we get here, we should say? Not what happens now. How did we get here? What led South African Airways to this situation? Well, a number of factors. Poor strategic planning, poor decisions, poorly executed expansions, corruption, patronage, poor decisions, race-based policies. Remember, just back in 2012, South African Airlines intentionally discriminated against white pilot candidates who wanted to fly for the airline on the basis that the balance was unreasonable. Let me remind you of that. So this is August of 2012. South African Airways spokesperson Kabelo Ledwaba told Beeld, which is an Afrikaans language newspaper, which had done an undercover investigation, told Beeld that the cadet program was being advertised online as an initiative to bring pilot demographics in line with the country's broader demographics. Only 15% of South African Airlines pilots are currently black, and this includes Indians and coloreds. The rest are white, and 91% of them are men. Well, honestly, folks, I have to be clear with you. I don't really care if the pilots are green, purple, or blue. What I care about is whether they're competent. And if the South African Airlines can't hire pilots who are trained and competent from a diverse background, then perhaps they ought to spend more effort into recruiting folks earlier to get into the pilot programs and not exclude people from it. This was in 2012. So you add that race-based policies along with bad business decisions and a little bit of misfortune for the airline too. We'll have to give a little bit of a break there. And South African Airways has reached the end of its tether. Here we find ourselves on the 14th of April, 2020, 86 years after the creation of South African Airways, and the airline is at the end of the road. Well, what comes next? Who will pick up the slack? And how will South Africans get around? It's a long drive from the Cape up to Limpopo, to the Limpopo River. Beitbridge to Cape Town is a long trip. If you want to go from Polokwane to Cape Town, that's a long drive. Flight is a better option. So with that, folks, that's all I have to say for tonight about South African Airways at the end of its road. I thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, I ask that you subscribe to my channel. You can do that by pushing that little button right down there, subscribe. And just next to that, you'll see a bell icon. Please click on that. Remember to click the personalized notifications, and that will update you each time that I produce a video. Also, if you have any comments, any complaints, any suggestions, please offer them. I do listen to comments. They are welcome, positive and negative. And if you like the video, I ask that you push that like button as well. Liking the video draws attention to it from YouTube and gets it more search features and draws people to the channel. And the message gets out only if people are aware of it. So I thank you for your time. I thank you for tuning in once again here to Indaba Africa. And I'll be following up with an update on South Africa specifically, talking about the events of today that came out of the Reserve Bank and more about South African Airlines and how South Africa is going to cope with the COVID-19 crisis as it progresses through the rest of April and the country is in desperate straits short of funding. So thank you very much, and I'll catch you next time here on Indaba Africa.